In 2004, the global television industry experienced a quiet earthquake. For decades, the name Thomson meant French industrial power. It was a sprawling engineering force that had grown so large it crossed the Atlantic in 1987 to purchase America's most historic television manufacturer, RCA. But in 2004, Thomson executives stood before the financial press to announce a new joint venture called TTE. The partner was China's TCL. On paper, it was a merger. In reality, it was an exit. The French giant was handing over its entire global television manufacturing apparatus, the vast picture tube factories, the supply chains, and the right to use the Thomson and RCA brand names. The physical consequence was devastating. Historic CRT plants in Europe and the Americas would soon shutter, dismissing thousands of workers who had mastered the art of television production. The television badge remained the same. The products sitting on European retail shelves still said Thomson, but the domestic manufacturing system behind it had vanished. The real story of Thomson is not simply a corporate handover. It is the story of how controlling the world's most impressive factories became a fatal liability, and how a national champion survived only by leaving the television behind entirely. This channel explores the European television brands, factories, and domestic rituals that once defined our living rooms. If you want to understand what happened to the industrial systems that built these memories, subscribe. Let us return to the era when a television was a matter of state. Before a television became a disposable, wall-mounted screen, it was a complex piece of heavy machinery. In post-war France, it was also a profound symbol of national independence. The Thomson name traces its origins to the late 19th century, initially connected to the American electrical engineer Elihu Thomson. But through decades of industrial mergers, most notably absorbing brand in the 1960s, the company became fiercely, distinctly French. As broadcasting expanded across Europe, national governments viewed consumer electronics not merely as a retail market, but as a strategic capability. A country that could not manufacture its own communications equipment was considered a country dangerously reliant on foreign powers. In the 1960s, this technological nationalism took physical form in broadcasting standards. While much of Western Europe adopted the PL color system, France aggressively developed CCAM. Launched officially in October 1967, CCAM was a brilliant, highly complex analog color system. It also functioned as an invisible industrial shield, effectively protecting the French domestic market from easy foreign imports. If a television was going to work perfectly in a Paris apartment, its internal chassis needed to be engineered specifically for the national standard. Thomson became the primary vehicle for this domestic ambition. Through a series of acquisitions in the 1970s, the company absorbed competing national brands, consolidating French manufacturing power. The consumer trusted the name. When a family prepared to make the significant financial commitment to purchase a color television, they studied catalogs that presented Thomson not as a cheap household appliance, but as an investment in domestic engineering. The physical presence of these sets was commanding. The heavy polished wooden cabinets dominated the corners of French living rooms. When switched on, the cathode ray tube hummed with a distinct static charge, taking several seconds to warm up before revealing the vibrant, highly saturated colors characteristic of CCAM broadcasts. A Thomson television meant long-term reliability. It was supported by a sprawling network of local repair technicians who kept thick service manuals on hand, ready to replace individual capacitors on a familiar European board. However, by the early 1980s, the stakes had grown too high for the open market. Japanese manufacturers were beginning to exert immense pressure on European borders, bypassing technical barriers with superior manufacturing efficiency. In 1982, the French government, under François Mitterrand, made a decisive move. They nationalized Thomson. The company became a state-owned enterprise. The logic was clear. The government would provide the capital needed to protect French industrial capacity against foreign invasion. Thomson would be the champion that held the line. The television had firmly anchored itself in the French home, subsidized by the state and protected by a unique broadcast signal. But the domestic market alone could no longer support the vast research costs required to survive the coming decade. The breakthrough did not come from a newly engineered circuit board or a cheaper plastic cabinet. It came from an aggressive, almost unthinkable corporate acquisition. In 1987, the American conglomerate General Electric wanted to exit the consumer electronics business. GE had recently acquired RCA, the company that had effectively commercialized color television in the United States and possessed a legacy of deep engineering. RCA controlled enormous manufacturing facilities and an immense domestic market share. But GE saw television hardware as a low-margin, capital-intensive burden. Thomson saw it as a lifeline. In a sweeping transnational deal, the French state-owned company acquired the consumer electronics division of GE, including the RCA brand. Almost overnight, Thomson transformed from a protected European champion into one of the largest television manufacturers on Earth. They now controlled a vast portion of the North American market. They owned sprawling picture tube factories in Marion, Indiana, and high-volume assembly plants in Mexico. The strategy was built entirely on scale. To compete globally with Japanese giants like Sony and Panasonic, a manufacturer needed to buy and produce parts in the millions. Specifically, they needed to control the most expensive and complex component of the television, the heavy glass cathode ray tube, or CRT. With the RCA acquisition, Thomson gained control of unprecedented tube manufacturing capabilities. They could design the chassis in Europe and America, build the glass tubes in their own high-capacity plants, and assemble the final products across a vast global network. They were no longer just assembling televisions. They were controlling the fundamental physics of the display. The product on the retail floor reflected this new industrial confidence, pushing boundaries far beyond a generic box. In Europe, Thomson leaned heavily into high-end industrial design, attempting to elevate the television from a simple appliance to an artistic statement. They hired visionary designers like Philippe Starck to reimagine the physical form of the screen. In 1994, this collaboration birthed the Thomson Gym Nature, a portable television encased entirely in high-density compressed wood. It was an environmental and aesthetic statement, proving a television could be a piece of avant-garde European furniture that blended naturally into a domestic space. The wooden cabinet carried a premium physical weight, signaling exceptional material quality and domestic pride to the French consumer. For the average household, the advantage of this dual market strategy was clear. A Thomson television in a French hypermarket, or an RCA television in an American appliance store, represented a powerhouse of integrated engineering. If a part failed, the warranty network was deep and established. The local repair technician could still order a proprietary component and solder it onto a familiar, well-documented board. But this vast global expansion hit a profound structural vulnerability. Thomson had staked its entire corporate future on the cathode ray tube. They had purchased the biggest factories. They had mastered the complex chemistry of applying phosphors to heavy glass screens. They had built an empire on deep analog technology. They had finally conquered the global living room. But they had done so precisely at the moment the physical nature of the television was preparing to change forever. The 1990s represented the absolute zenith of Thomson's physical industrial scale. The company had transformed into a global leviathan, an enterprise so large it seemed to dictate the physical geometry of millions of living rooms. Surviving product catalogs from this era reveal a staggering array of models. Thomson produced everything from compact, functional portable sets designed for the kitchen counter to colossal, heavy home theater units that required 2 delivery workers to carry up a flight of stairs. In Europe, the Thomson brand was ubiquitous. It sponsored major sporting events and dominated the brightly lit electronics aisles of hypermarkets like Carrefour and specialist retailers like Darty. Across the Atlantic, the RCA brand, now entirely engineered and managed by Thomson, maintained a fierce, high-volume grip on the American mass market. To truly comprehend the scale of this operation, one must look past the polished wooden and plastic cabinets and examine the picture tube factories. The cathode ray tube was not a simple electronic component. It was a marvel of heavy physics and chemistry. Manufacturing a CRT required immense, capital-intensive industrial infrastructure. Silica had to be melted in towering furnaces and formed into thick glass envelopes capable of withstanding extreme internal vacuums. Precise layers of toxic chemical phosphors had to be applied to the inside of the screen in pristine, cleanroom conditions. Heavy electronic guns designed to fire beams of electrons with pinpoint accuracy had to be meticulously aligned by skilled technicians. Thomson's tube plants in cities like Genlis in France, Anagni in Italy, and Marion in Indiana were not mere assembly sheds. They were sprawling industrial fortresses. They employed tens of thousands of workers across multiple continents. They anchored entire local economies, dictating the daily rhythm of surrounding towns. A Thomson television was not just a familiar brand name printed on a plastic bezel. It was the final physical testament to an enormous logistical chain of human labor and engineering mastery. When a consumer purchased a high-end Thomson set at Darty, they were buying into a closed, secure ecosystem. The retailer provided the delivery, and local service centers held extensive inventories of proprietary Thomson replacement parts. If a high-voltage component failed years later, a local technician knew exactly how to navigate the European design board. The repair was an expected part of the appliance's life cycle, a physical agreement between the manufacturer and the household that the investment would be protected. In the late 1990s, this system culminated in profound moments of cultural memory. Consider a French household in the summer of 1998, preparing to watch the national football team compete in the FIFA World Cup final. The family gathered around a widescreen Thomson CRT. There was a distinct sensory ritual to operating these machines. The heavy, satisfying mechanical click of the power button, the faint, high-pitched hum of the flyback transformer engaging. The crackle of static electricity on the surface of the glass as the tube warmed up, eventually pulling the vibrant, saturated colors of the broadcast into the darkened room. The television was a reliable, substantial presence that held the family's attention. By 1999, the French government recognized that the enterprise had outgrown its protected, state-owned status. To raise the vast capital required for the coming digital revolution, the state began to privatize Thomson Multimedia. The stock went public, and the national champion officially transitioned into a globally traded corporate powerhouse. This was the emotional and industrial peak of the company's history. The stakes had never been higher. If this sprawling industrial capability disappeared, Europe would lose more than just a familiar logo. It would permanently lose the strategic independence to engineer, manufacture, and repair the central screen of the modern home. The deep link between the domestic laboratory, the regional factory, and the family living room would be permanently severed. For a brief, triumphant window, the Thomson system appeared invincible, protected by unparalleled production volume. But behind the thick glass of their highly profitable screens, the foundation was silently cracking. The television was about to lose its physical depth, and in doing so, it would destroy the very factories Thomson had spent a decade acquiring. The first small crack did not appear in a bankruptcy court. It appeared in the brightly lit aisles of high-end electronics exhibitions in the late 1990s, taking the form of an early flat-panel display. Initially, plasma and LCD screens were prohibitively expensive, relegated to luxury buyers in corporate boardrooms. Thomson executives looking at their highly profitable, high-volume CRT factories believed they had time. They calculated that the heavy glass tube would remain the unquestioned standard for the mass market for at least another decade. They miscalculated the aggressive speed of the Asian component supply chain. Companies like Samsung, LG, and Sharp were investing billions of dollars into dedicated LCD panel foundries. They were willing to subsidize early manufacturing losses to build unprecedented volume. As the 2000s began, the retail price of flat panels began to drop with terrifying speed. The physical nature of the television was changing. A traditional CRT pushed deep into the room, occupying dedicated floor space. An LCD could be hung flush on a wall. More importantly for the retail ecosystem, an LCD took up a fraction of the store display space and cost significantly less to ship across the ocean. Suddenly, Thomson's greatest physical asset, its sprawling global network of CRT picture tube factories, became a lethal financial anchor. Every time a consumer chose a thin, imported LCD over a bulky CRT, Thomson's factories lost critical volume. A tube plant requires peak, continuous output to remain profitable. A manufacturer cannot afford to run a towering glass furnace at half capacity. As consumer demand dropped, the fixed operating costs of these vast European and American plants began to bleed the company dry. Thomson attempted to pivot. They began selling LCD televisions under their own trusted brand. But there was a fundamental structural difference. Thomson did not own the underlying LCD foundries. They were forced to purchase the raw display panels from the very Asian competitors they were trying to fight against. The company had lost control of the core technological component. This shift in manufacturing fundamentally broke the domestic repair culture. For decades, a French repair technician could open the back of a broken Thomson CRT, consult a thick, highly detailed service manual, and confidently solder a new capacitor onto a familiar European chassis. But as the transition to outsourced flat panels accelerated, that manual became entirely useless. A technician would unscrew the plastic back of a modern set only to find a sealed, imported module. The internal boards were generic. Individual replacement parts were virtually impossible to source locally. When the television failed, it was often cheaper for the household to throw the entire unit away than to attempt a repair. The badge on the front bezel still said Thomson, but the screen inside, the actual physical technology producing the image, belonged to someone else. By 2004, the financial hemorrhage became unsustainable. Thomson's management accepted a harsh industrial reality. They could no longer afford to manufacture televisions. The announcement of the TTE joint venture with China's TCL was publicly framed as a strategic global partnership. In reality, it was a capitulation. Thomson transferred its remaining factories, its research centers, and its television workforce to the new entity. For TCL, the deal was never primarily about acquiring aging European factories. It was a sophisticated Trojan horse strategy. Asian brands often struggled to gain immediate consumer trust in Western retail markets. By taking control of the Thomson and RCA trademarks, TCL could instantly secure premium retail shelf space across Europe and America. They could bypass decades of marketing by wearing the trusted mask of a domestic heritage brand. Within a year, TCL took full financial control of the venture. The physical consequence was immediate and devastating. The historic production lines were no longer necessary. The sprawling CRT plant in Genlis, France, eventually closed. The vast American tube plants shuttered. Thousands of specialized workers, technicians, and engineers who had spent decades mastering the chemistry and physics of television manufacturing were dismissed. The industrial towns that had long relied on the steady rhythmic hum of the assembly line grew quiet. The company had not gone bankrupt, but the system had collapsed. The trademark remained. The production line stopped. The factory doors were locked. The television that sat in the European living room was no longer a product of national engineering. It was an imported screen wearing a familiar mask. The original corporate entity did not disappear. It fundamentally transformed. Recognizing that consumer hardware was a lost cause, the company shifted its focus entirely away from the living room. It leaned into professional media services, digital film processing, and its expansive patent portfolio. In 2010, the historic French enterprise officially changed its name to Technicolor. The name Thomson was left behind, surviving only as a disembodied trademark. Today, if you walk into a European electronics retailer, you can still find flat-panel televisions bearing the Thomson logo. They are smart, lightweight, and aggressively priced, but they are not manufactured by a French national champion. They are produced by TCL or assembled by other international licensees who rent the name to signal reliability to a generation that still remembers the heavy CRT sets of their childhood. This is not simply empty nostalgia for older technology. The story of Thomson matters because it tracks the exact historical moment Europe lost the living room. It demonstrates how unprecedented industrial scale can become an inescapable trap, and how quickly a complex, localized manufacturing system can be completely dismantled when the underlying physical technology shifts. The domestic knowledge of how to build, support, and repair a mass-market screen is gone, replaced entirely by a global supply chain where the brand is merely an intellectual property asset applied at the very end of the assembly line. Look closely at a modern Thomson television sitting in a contemporary apartment. The plastic enclosure is thin. The screen is a uniform sheet of dark glass. When you turn it on, there is no mechanical click. There is no rising hum of high voltage, no static charge gathering on the surface, and no deep chassis requiring the knowledge of a trained local technician. There is only a silent, imported panel lighting up a historic French name that outlived the factories that built it. See you in the next video.